Dayton, Ohio, January 1971. 11:18 in the morning, old snow had turned gray along the curbs, while wet boots left long water streaks across the freshly mopped hallway floor. The lunch bell had not yet rung. The smell of floor cleaner still lingered beneath the fluorescent lights, but from the far end of the building, browning onions, tomato sauce, and warm bread had already begun drifting through the cafeteria doors. At the last desk in the classroom, a child held 3 10-cent coins and 1 5-cent coin in a coat pocket, 35 cents, just enough for a school lunch. The edges of the coins had pressed a red circle into the child's palm, because they had been clenched since the previous class period, opened for counting, then closed again. The tray, 35 cents, and the rekeep box under the work table. At the end of the hallway, a 58-year-old woman stood beside a steel work table in the school kitchen. She had been there since before 6 o'clock that morning. The apron pocket carried a streak of flour, a spot of red sauce, and a short pencil barely long enough for 3 fingers to hold. She bent down and opened a low cabinet door. A wooden recipe box rested beneath the work table, its lid not fully closed because a softened corner of an index card protruded from inside. She placed the box beside a cup of cold coffee and opened the lid. The first card read, "Porcupine meatballs, 312 servings." Beneath it, another line of pencil writing slanted across the card. "If there are children still at the end of the line, add more sauce and 1 small meatball." The thumb smoothed the corner of the card. The clock on the wall moved forward another minute. The bell rang. Classroom doors flew open. Its rubber-soled shoes pounded across the tile floor and then slowed as the lunch line came into view. The first tray was pulled from the stack, pale blue in color, its edges scratched white, at one corner still marked by a dried tomato sauce stain that the dishwasher had never fully removed. It slid onto the steel rail with its compartments still empty. Lunch did not begin when the bell rang. It began many hours earlier, in the hands of women who knew how to make a tray substantial enough to carry a child through the afternoon. A metal ladle touched the side of a pot. Steam rose onto the glass. The line moved forward 1 step. The first meatballs had grains of rice protruding like tiny spines. On another day, there would be a square slice of pizza cut with a scratched metal ruler, where even a slight shift in the cut could leave a smaller piece for the child at the end of the line. There would be a dish named after a distant country, with pale brown gravy flowing over a mound of potatoes, and a basket of stale bread tested at the edges before the still usable interior became tomorrow's dessert. Near the end of the line, a ladle would tilt a little farther over the tray of a child with a cold. No one spoke about it. The tray simply became a little heavier. Some children remembered the warm coins in their hands. Others remembered the woman behind the counter who looked at the tray before looking at the face of the child carrying it. The recipe box still held other cards beneath its lid. The woman set the card down on the work table, pulled the ladle toward herself, and glanced at the clock. The lunch line had begun to move. Dinner number 30 had to reach the tray before the first child changed their mind after seeing the grains of rice protruding from the meat. Dayton, Ohio, 1971. Bowman knew which tray was too light. Dayton, Ohio, winter of 1971. The 58-year-old woman held the long ladle with both hands, her left hand near the top of the handle and her right hand supporting the back where her wrist no longer bent completely. Before this school kitchen, she had pulled wet bed sheets from industrial washing machines and stacked them onto steel carts. Now, in front of her were more than 300 trays. She could not remember every student's name, but she remembered which child ate only white-colored foods, which one traded a carton of milk for canned peaches, and which tray was lighter than the others. Dinner number 30 was porcupine meatballs. 3 meatballs dropped into the large compartment, white grains of rice protruding through the red sauce. A serving with green beans, a small bread roll, and regular milk usually cost about 35 cents. Ground beef was mixed with uncooked rice, onions, salt, and pepper, then arranged tightly in deep baking pans. Thin tomato sauce helped the rice expand before the meat dried out. The day the fifth-grade class did not go on its field trip because of snow, she found one extra meatball beneath the sauce for a tray near the end of the line. Small grains of rice helped ensure that the children at the end of the line still received hot meat. Dinner number 29 was school cafeteria rectangular pizza. Dough was spread across an oiled baking pan, covered with sauce, crumbled meat and cheese all the way to the edges. One serving cost about 40 cents. After baking, she placed a metal ruler across the surface, counted 6 vertical cuts and 4 horizontal cuts. The final narrow piece would be matched with half a piece from the edge of the pan. On the recipe card beside a dried sauce stain was a pencil note. Count again before cutting. The pizza did not need to be round, but the final piece still had to be large enough. Dinner number 28 was salmon croquettes. Canned salmon was flaked apart, mixed with cracker crumbs, eggs, and onions, then shaped into oval patties. One serving with macaroni salad, peas, tart sauce, and milk usually cost about 45 cents. The crust of the croquette cracked lightly at the touch of a fork, leaving a dark ring of oil on the paper napkin. Some children kept the fish tucked into the corner of the tray, while others ate only the crust. When a small child stared at the croquette for too long, she added an extra spoonful of macaroni salad beside it. Some dishes divided an entire lunch table into 2 sides the moment they touched the tray. Dinner number 27 was American chop suey. Elbow macaroni, ground beef, tomatoes, and bell peppers were ladled into a hot, substantial portion costing about 35 cents. She stopped cooking the pasta while the centers were still slightly firm because it would continue softening in the sauce and on the steam table. The card tucked beneath the pepper shaker read, "Stop the pasta early. It still has to wait for children." The pasta entered the line slightly firm so that it could reach the final tray without losing its shape. At 12:43 in the afternoon, the ladle was placed into a basin of hot water. The 4 cards returned to the recipe box. Her finger paused on the next card. Turkey tetrazzini, Grand Rapids, Michigan, 1974. The woman, too, placed a little of the outside world onto a tray. Grand Rapids, Michigan, winter of 1974. The corner of a recipe card protruded from the apron pocket of the 49-year-old woman as she wrote the menu on the board with a piece of white chalk. Her father had worked in a furniture factory. Her mother had cooked for 6 children on a small stove behind a rented house. She had never been to Sweden, Mexico, or Spain. Most of the students in the hallway had not either, and familiar names entered the kitchen through the school district's recipe collection. But once they reached the tray, they still had to be familiar enough for 300 children to pick up a fork. Dinner number 26 was turkey tetrazzini, about 50 cents for a serving with carrots, bread, and milk. Chopped turkey was mixed with shortcut spaghetti, canned mushrooms, and a white sauce made from butter, flour, milk, and broth. She drew a spoon across the bottom of the pot. Only when the clean trail remained visible for a single breath were the pasta and turkey added. The edges of the pan held crumbs that were browner and crispier, while the center remained soft and steaming. No piece of turkey was discarded simply because it was no longer a whole slice. The smaller pieces still returned to the tray as a complete meal. Dinner number 25 was cheeseburger pie, about 45 cents. Ground beef browned with onions was spread across the bottom of a pan, covered with a mixture of eggs, milk, and flour, and topped with cheese during the final minutes of baking. The pan had to rest before being cut. If the spatula went in too soon, the meat slid to one side, and the batter remained behind. Square portions were kept intact so that every child received all 3 layers. One square carried the flavor of a hamburger through the lunch line without causing anyone to lose part of their serving. Dinner number 24 was Swedish meatballs, about 55 cents. A pale brown gravy made from drippings, flour, and milk flowed over egg noodles or a mound of mashed potatoes. On the card was a small note: "Don't let the name scare the children. Put potatoes beside it." Some children slowly read the name of the dish on the menu board before cutting the first meatball in half with the edge of a fork. For many children, the name Sweden first appeared on a menu board beside a spoonful of pale brown gravy. Dinner number 23 was hexagonal Mexican-style school pizza, about 60 cents. The 6-sided pizza was topped with ground beef, seasoned with cumin, mild chili powder, and cheese. The corners needed to be crisp but not hard. When the trays were returned, she looked at the crusts left behind to know whether the next batch should come out sooner. The unfamiliar name disappeared from the board, but the 6-sided shape remained easy for the children to remember. At the end of the day, the menu board was wiped clean. The Fiestada card returned to her apron pocket, while the next card carried a water stain in one corner. Creamed peas on toast, Scranton, Pennsylvania, winter of 1970. The woman kept warmth for children in wet shows, Scranton, Pennsylvania, winter of 1972. The recipe box was opened for the second time on a table dusted with a thin layer of flour. Among the cards was a scrap of paper recording the morning temperature, 19 degrees Fahrenheit. A 53-year-old woman had walked 6 blocks through snow that had not yet been completely shoveled. Her wet gloves rested on a warm pipe behind the stove, her scarf hung beside the food storage room, and her spare shoes had already been pulled out from beneath the table. She had worked here for 14 years. Most winter meals prepared by her hands carried only shades of white, yellow, and light brown. She watched the steam, the softness of the food, and the amount of time it still had to wait on the steam table. On the first card was a faded note: "Pour gravy over bread at the last minute." Dinner number 22 was Spanish rice. A side serving cost about 18 cents. A full meal with an entree, vegetables, and milk cost about 45 cents. The rice was cooked with tomatoes, onions, green peppers, cumin, and a small amount of mild chili powder. She used a spatula to fold the bottom layer upward, adding hot water along the edges of the pan when the grains began to dry. Reddish-orange color made some children hesitate with their spoons, but the aroma of softened onions and the heat rising from the center of the pan kept them interested. The color made children pause, but the warmth brought the spoon back. Dinner number 21 was creamed peas on toast, about 27 cents when served with fruit and milk. Butter, flour, and milk were stirred into a white sauce. The peas were added only at the end. Toast was already waiting on the tray, but she waited until the child stood directly in front of the counter before pouring on the sauce. The card beside the pot had curled from the steam, and the final line read, "Do not pour on early." The center of the bread softened, while the outer edges still broke lightly beneath the edge of a fork. A slice of bread held the hot sauce long enough for cold hands to warm up. Dinner number 20 was mashed potatoes with ground beef gravy, about 40 cents. The beef was browned, flour was stirred into the drippings, and broth was added until the gravy reached the proper thickness. She folded the lower layer of potatoes upward so that the surface would not form a skin. The gravy flowed into the hollow children, often made in the center of the mound of potatoes, carrying small pieces of meat through every spoonful. Meat did not need to remain in large pieces once the gravy had found its way into every bite of potato. Dinner number 19 was shepherd's pie, about 50 cents. Ground beef, gravy, peas, carrots, and corn rested beneath a layer of potatoes shaped into small peaks with the tines of a fork. She rotated the pan after every few servings so that all of the browned edges would not end up on one side. Browned potato peaks made each square look complete before the fork reached the meat beneath. After the final lunch period, the 4 cards returned to the box. She paused at the card marked with a dark grease stain, chicken fried steak. In another kitchen, the sound of hot oil had just begun. Indianapolis, Indiana, 1975. The woman Leo stood beside the fryer and the food's children counted before eating. Indianapolis, Indiana, 1975. Before 11:20 in the morning, the 46-year-old woman had to send out the number of trays written on the slip of paper in her apron pocket from the frying station and the ovens. She had once worked the evening shift in a roadside diner, where the sound of trucks stopping outside often arrived together with the sound of potatoes dropping into hot oil. An old burn scar ran across the back of her left hand. When oil splattered, she simply lowered the piece of meat closer to the surface of the pan. In a kitchen full of soft pasta, mashed potatoes, and thoroughly cooked vegetables, a crisp crust was enough to make the lunch line slow down. Dinner number 18 was chicken fried steak. About 65 cents for a meal that included potatoes, vegetables, milk, and white pepper gravy. Thin slices of beef were tenderized, coated twice in flour, then fried until the crust held firmly. She placed them on a metal rack so the oil could drip away before moving them to the steam table. Brown drippings in the pan were stirred with flour and milk into a gravy that flowed over the meat and down onto the potatoes. The edge of a plastic fork pressed down, the crust cracked, and the hot meat beneath appeared. The coating made the thin slice of meat produce a sound larger than its size. Dinner number 17 was corn dog bites, about 35 cents. Sausages were cut into short pieces, dipped into slightly sweet corn batter, and fried in batches. She counted them while placing them onto the rack and checked every tray again before sending it out. A missing piece would be replaced with a pair of long tongs. Ketchup left red streaks on the trays, while children at the tables looked at neighboring portions before picking up the first piece. 5 or 6 small pieces were enough to make an entire table start counting. Dinner number 16 was cheese rolls, about 30 cents when served with soup, fruit, and milk. A slice of cheese was completely enclosed in soft dough, left to rise, then baked until the surface turned brown. The rolls in the center of the pan were checked first because they baked more slowly. A grease-stained card beside the clock read, "Let cool 3 minutes." Children will not wait. Strands of cheese still stretched toward a child's chin when the roll had just been bitten in half. Dinner number 15 was cheese dreams, about 25 cents. Its white bread was topped with a slice of cheese and baked open-faced, served alongside tomato soup. She adjusted the timer 1 minute earlier when she noticed too many crusts returning on the trays. At the end of the lunch period, the oil had quieted. The card was wiped with the corner of her apron and placed beside the student count for the following day. Beyond the cafeteria, the last pieces of bread were still wiping up the red soup from the bottoms of trays. C. Leveland, OEO 1975. The woman. Wowicho looked at one piece of meat and saw 317 trays. Cleveland, Ohio, at 6:40 in the morning, 1975. The recipe box was opened for the 3rd time beneath kitchen lights that had not yet completely driven away the darkness of night. A 56-year-old woman placed a yellow note on the table. 317 children. Prepare 12 extra servings. Earlier in life, she had packed ball bearings in an automotive parts factory. At work had left her with the habit of looking across an entire long table before touching the first item. In the school kitchen, she looked at the sacks of potatoes, trays of meat, blocks of cheese, and the empty trays stacked behind the door. She did not see a piece of meat as a completed serving. She saw how many hands it still had to pass through. Dinner number 14 was scalloped potatoes with ham, about 45 cents when served with green beans, bread, and milk. The potatoes were sliced thin, layered with onions, and covered with white sauce. The ham was cut into pieces smaller than a child could count at a glance, and scattered through each layer. She poured the sauce along the sides of the pan, covered it with foil to hold in the steam, and uncovered it so the edges could brown. After several servings, the pan was rotated so the crisp edges would not all end up on the first trays. The card beside the oven carried an old water ring. The ham was cut into small pieces, but its smoky flavor still traveled through the entire pan of potatoes. Dinner number 13 was Salisbury steak with mushroom gravy, about 55 cents. The ground beef was mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and onions, formed into patties of nearly equal size, then covered with brown gravy. The breadcrumbs held the juices inside, while the food waited on the steam table. She pulled gravy from the corners of the pan onto the patties along the edges, where the meat dried out more quickly. A few soft mushroom slices slid onto the mound of white potatoes. Most returned to the dishwashing area, while the meat rarely came back untouched. The word steak appeared on the menu board, while the patty filled most of the tray's main compartment. Dinner number 12 was hot dog boats, about 40 cents. Hot dogs were split lengthwise, placed in soft buns, then topped with chili, cheese, and onions. The portions without onions were turned the opposite way to prevent confusion. With onions, extra chili? She listened to the answers, prepared each tray accordingly, and sent it down the line. After the final lunch period, the actual count was recorded, 324. 7 more servings than expected. Not a single tray was missing its main dish. Every child had received a bun, a sausage, and the toppings requested at the counter. Before closing the box, she gently squeezed a piece of stale bread and set it aside on a plate. It was not spoiled yet. Tomorrow a knife would cut it into small cubes. 1973. The woman who turned stale bread, beef bones, and opened fruit into another meal. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 1973. After the lunch period ended, the 60-year-old woman remained at the preparation table while dirty trays slid through the dishwashing window. She had grown up in a steelworker's family. A Friday paycheck had to last until the end of the following week. In front of her were a basket of stale bread, several beef bones, an opened can of fruit cocktail, pieces of meat too irregular to place neatly on trays by themselves. She squeezed the edge of the bread, smelled the meat, wrote the date in pencil, and placed each container at the front of the refrigerator. She had grown up hearing the old saying, "Waste not, want not." She had grown up hearing the old saying, "Waste not, want not." She had grown up hearing the old saying, "Waste not, want not." She had grown up hearing the old saying, "Waste not, want not." Bread was pudding not yet baked. Beef bones were broth not yet simmered. The can of fruit still contained a tray of cake within it. Dinner number 11 was vegetable beef soup, about 30 cents when served with crackers, fruit, and milk. Beef bones, meat scraps, and uneven cuts were placed into cold water early in the morning and slowly simmered with carrots, potatoes, celery, corn, and tomatoes. She stirred from the bottom upward so the meat would not remain in the pot, while the first bowls received only broth. A child still wearing a coat stepped up to the counter. The steam from the soup fogged the child's glasses. The ladle tilted an extra half-turn. On the card was written, "Use what is still good. There must be meat in the last serving." The bowl became a little heavier in 2 cold hands. Dinner number 10 was bread pudding with vanilla sauce, about 15 cents. Old bread was cut into cubes, soaked in milk, eggs, sugar, vanilla, and cinnamon, and left to rest before baking. The driest pieces sat at the bottom and absorbed more of the liquid. Warm vanilla sauce flowed into the cracks, leaving a cream-colored streak in the corner of the pan. The children saw only the slightly crisp top and the soft interior. She had seen that dessert the previous afternoon when the edges of the bread were dry, but the center was still good. Dinner number 9 was fruit cocktail cake, also about 15 cents. The fruit and syrup were mixed into the batter, while the final pieces of cherry from the can were scattered across the pan with space between them. The card instructed, "Don't let all the cherries end up in the first 4 pieces." One small red dot was enough to make a child choose that piece of cake before the one beside it. At the end of the day, the bones had become broth, the bread had become pudding, and the can of fruit had become golden squares of cake. She returned the 3 cards to the recipe box. Outside, it was still dark in another kitchen where yeast had just been stirred into warm water. Fort Wayne, Indiana, autumn of 1970. The woman began her shift before a single footstep. Echoed in the hallway, Fort Wayne, Indiana, at 5 o'clock in the morning, autumn of 1972. The school grounds were still dark, with only a row of windows behind the cafeteria illuminated. A 51-year-old woman unlocked the kitchen door with a heavy ring of keys, hung up her coat, then took a small key from her apron pocket to open the compartment where the recipe box was kept. Her husband had just returned from the night shift at an electrical wire factory as she tied her shoes and left home. The baking cards were marked with flour caught in the paper grooves, transparent butter stains, numbers that had been revised many times. One card read, "Start at 5:10. First batch must be in the oven before 8:30. She plunged a metal measuring cup into the flour sack. Not a single footstep could yet be heard in the hallway. Dinner number 8 was school cafeteria cinnamon rolls, about 20 cents each. Yeast was dissolved in warm water, dough was kneaded, left to rise, rolled out, and spread with butter, brown sugar, and cinnamon. She used a length of string to cut each roll so the spirals would not be compressed, then left space between them in the pan for the second rise. Vanilla icing was poured over the rolls while they were still hot, running down between the soft coils of dough. Some children saved the center for the last bite. Others wrapped a roll in a paper napkin to take home. By the time the smell of cinnamon reached the hallway, the baker had already spent nearly the entire morning in the kitchen. Dinner number 7 was oatmeal raisin cookies, about 10 cents each. Oats, butter, brown sugar, eggs, cinnamon, and raisins were mixed in a large bowl with a long-handled spoon. She rotated the baking sheets because the back corner of the oven ran hotter, then removed the cookies while the centers were still soft. The card was written, "The pan will finish the rest." The edges produced a faint, crisp sound, while the raisins still clung to teeth. The cookie disappeared in a few bites, but its cinnamon aroma had been inside the school since early morning. Dinner number 6 was peanut butter bars, about 15 cents. The oat base was pressed down with the bottom of a metal measuring cup covered with peanut butter, then topped with a thin layer of chocolate. The knife was dipped into warm water before cutting the bars into small squares. At the lunch table, one square could be traded for a carton of milk or a cup of fruit. Each small square carried the work of the early shift into a few bites at noon. By 10:48 in the morning, the final batch came out of the oven. Returned the 3 cards to the box, then touched newer cards that were clean and carried almost no handwritten notes. Outside the back door, a delivery truck was backing up to the loading dock. Flint, Michigan, 1877, the woman learned how to keep care inside foods that were already prepared. Flint, Michigan, 1977. The delivery truck backed up to the rear entrance while the kitchen was short 2 employees, and the lower deck of the oven on the left side had stopped heating. A 44-year-old woman checked each carton before recording the delivery time in a logbook. Tater tots, chicken patties, and bags of pudding mix were packed inside, each portion nearly identical to the next. She placed an old flour-stained recipe card beside the neatly printed instructions on the box. 360 children would still walk through the doors when the bell rang. The shipment saved preparation time, but she still checked the height of each pudding cup, tested the patties in the center of each pan, and marked the sandwich without mayonnaise. Dinner number 5 was crispy potato casserole, about 55 cents when served with vegetables, fruit, and milk. Ground beef browned with onions was spread across the bottom of a pan, covered with cream of mushroom soup, then topped with rows of frozen potatoes. There were no longer potatoes to peel, boil, or mash. She still arranged each potato as evenly as possible so that the cutting lines would pass through roughly the same number of pieces. When the casserole came from the oven, the top half was crisp and dry, while the lower half had softened in the meat sauce. Children counted the potatoes that remained whole before digging into the layer beneath. The potatoes were identical, but the person arranging them still looked at each serving. Dinner number 4 was a chicken patty sandwich, about 60 cents. Breaded chicken patties were placed with space between them on baking trays, while the cooking times for each batch were written in chalk because the 2 ovens heated unevenly. One worker opened the buns, another placed the chicken inside, and a third closed them. She broke apart the patty in the center of the tray to test it, then set aside one sandwich without mayonnaise in the second row. The back of the old recipe card noted exactly that. The chicken patty was no different from the others. The sandwich was still made different by one small decision. Dinner number 3 was butterscotch pudding, about 15 cents. The prepared mix was beaten with cold milk and then divided into cups arranged in rows. She bent down until her eyes were level with the table and added 1 extra spoonful to a cup that sat lower than the others. As the pudding cooled, a thin skin formed across the pale brown surface. Some children lifted that layer with the tip of a spoon. Others stirred it back in. The kitchen made the cups nearly identical. The children still found their own way to eat each one. By the end of the lunch period, 360 servings had left the counter. The chicken patty card was placed deeper inside the recipe box. The long ladle was used less often now, but at the end of the line, one child still carried a tray with both hands. Ahead waited the scent of apple cinnamon and a pot of red pasta already prepared and waiting. The last tray, the scent of apple cinnamon, and the recip box closed again. Dayton, Ohio, the end of the lunch period, 1971. The sound of chairs being pulled across the floor had begun to fade. The long tables remained dented milk cartons, crumpled paper napkins, a few kernels of corn, and streaks of ketchup dragged by fingertips. The 58-year-old woman still stood behind the counter, her right wrist lower than it had been that morning, her apron carrying an additional stain of sauce. The final tray was pulled from the stack, its edges scratched white, and one small compartment still holding a little water. The recipe box lay open on the steel table. In front was the apple crisp card. Behind it was the school goulash card, softened at all 4 corners. Dinner number 2 was apple crisp, about 20 cents per serving. The apples were peeled, sliced, and mixed with sugar, cinnamon, and a little flour. Oats, brown sugar, butter, and flour were rubbed into crumbs and scattered over the top without being pressed down. The apple juices bubbled around the edges of the pan. She tested the center with the tip of a knife and then allowed the dessert to rest before serving it. The crisp topping broke beneath the spoon, while the apples underneath still held their heat. On the card was a brown fingerprint beside the word cinnamon and a note that read, "Serve first. Apples stay hot longer." The scent of apple cinnamon drifted through the room of steel and plastic like steam from the kitchen of a family home. Dinner number 1 was cafeteria goulash, about 35 cents when served with green beans, a small bread roll, and milk. Ground beef was browned with onions, tomatoes, and dried seasonings. The elbow macaroni was stopped while the centers were still slightly firm, because it still had to wait on the steam table. For each serving, she pulled the ladle all the way to the bottom of the pot, where the meat usually settled. Near the end of the line, one child stood before an empty tray without opening a hand. She glanced toward the supervisor, then served a portion of the red pasta, added an extra bread roll, and pushed the tray forward. No one stopped. The tray was simply no longer empty. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a child who had carried 35 cents that morning placed the tray onto the conveyor. On it remained a streak of sauce, a few kernels of corn, and a plastic fork lying diagonally across the compartment. Behind the counter, the final 2 cards returned to the recipe box. The lid lowered, but another card corner still remained outside the edge. The box was closed after lunch, while other softened cards remained beneath the lid. Square pizza, meatballs in red sauce, warm cinnamon rolls, and other dishes remained in school records, recipe boxes, and the memories of the children who once carried those trays. Old American Kitchen preserves those names before the writing on the cards fades. Some lunches were not perfect, but behind every tray was a person who tried to make it warm enough, filling enough, and kind enough before the bell rang.